To begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are virtually gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm finding that these kinds of online events and the lack of physical presence in our virtual meetings makes the importance of place even more palpable. So I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the historic and contemporary caretakers of the land on which we work, learn, and teach at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dr. Biz Neidam, Assistant Professor of German in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies. And I'm the organizer of today's keynote event, as well as the associated virtual workshop entitled The New Media Aesthetics of Migration, which is taking place today and tomorrow. To give you a bit of a context on the work we're doing in this workshop, to frame today and tomorrow's keynote presentations, as well as the goals of our transnational research collaboration, the New Media Aesthetics of Migration workshop's programming seeks to examine emerging trends in the documentation, representation, and narrativization of global forced migration that draw on new digital and social media technologies. Hailing from a variety of disciplines, scholars participating in this workshop are interrogating how the affordances of new media contribute, represent, and intervene in these discourses and beyond. I'm very much looking forward to the conversations that will take place over the course of the next 2 days and the SSHRC grant application on the intersection of new media and migration that will come out of this week's workshop events. So let's get started. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Myria Georgiou for joining us today and participating in one of our workshop's 2 keynote events with her talk entitled, How Does a Subaltern Speak? A Critical Humanist Response for the Times of Migrant Hypermediation. I'd also like to take a moment to express my gratitude to the UBC Centre for Migration Studies for their generous support of our workshop events, as well as the many workshop participants and collaborators that are here in the virtual audience today, alongside students in my Bachelor of Media Studies course, which is also examining new media representations of forced migration with a focus on refugee agency and self-narration. And for those of you who are interested, I'm in the process of organizing a virtual exhibition of my students' final projects, which are new media ruminations on the concepts of migration and mobility, including webcomics, TikToks, GIFs, infographics, podcasts, and short films, and can be found at germ412.omeka.net. Before we begin, however, a technical note on this Zoom webinar event, which, as you have already noted, probably, and as I stated at the beginning, is being recorded. We are leaving the chat function on so that members of the webinar are able to discuss the presentations or communicate with me regarding issues. However, I'll be moderating the chat, and I ask that all conversations be thoughtful and respectful, as well as mindful of how excessive chatting can be distracting for all participants in today's session. Soon after Dr. Georgiou has completed her presentation, we will open the floor for questions. Please submit all questions via the Q&A function, which you will find at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible within the time available to us, though I apologize in advance if we are not able to address all inquiries. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Myria Georgiou is Professor of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Adopting a comparative and interdisciplinary approach, she is committed to putting the human of the urban, transnationally connected world at the core of her research. Specifically, in research conducted across 6 countries over the last 20 years, she's been studying communication practices and media representations that profoundly but unevenly shape meanings and experiences of citizenship and identity. Georgiou is the author and editor of 5 books, including Diaspora, Identity and the Media, Media and the City, Cosmopolitanism and Difference, and the Sage Handbook of Media and Migration. So I'll let you take it over from here, and I'll turn off my video and mute my mic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Biz, for the kind introduction. I see that we have already some video trouble, and I apologize for that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, no problem. Your video just seems to be frozen. We can give it a moment.
My video has frozen, but hopefully my slides will be okay. So with the hope that I will unfreeze, again, a big thank you to the organizers for this warm invite and introduction. Thank you especially to Bees for integrate me in this conversation that is starting today and it will continue over the next 2 days. I am now going to share my slides with the hope again that we will be able to have a productive conversation even if the video is not fully functioning.
We can see your slides, no problem. You might want to turn your video off and on just to see if it will correct itself.
Okay.
But we can see your slides.
Can you see just my slides or my notes as well?
Currently, we can just see your slides.
Okay, excellent. I will switch off my camera when I will be able to do those at the same time. You still cannot see me, I think, right? Even though my video is on.
That's correct. We can't see you, but we can see your slides. And when you turn off your video, your slides just get bigger. So I don't think
okay.
there's a problem.
Okay. Let's try to ignore that little image that comes on the slide anyway, okay. And hope to be able to elaborate a bit on the conversation around my slides. So. This is a conversation that is opening up that field of the politics, ethics, and aesthetics of representation of migrant voices. And when I talk about migrant voices, as Bis has already mentioned in relation to the event, this event and the conception of migration, even if it's not directly defined as such, very much focuses on forced migration and the context of forced migration, especially in my case, as I know it more particularly and in more detail within the European context. So in preparing that talk, I am trying to contribute to the bigger conversations that will be taking place over the next 2 days. And I am trying to use this opportunity to reflect on the critique and practice of mediated representations of migration. So within these conversations that have been taking place for a while, and of course are at the core of this event, the concept of voice has become very important, and it has gained a great symbolic and material relevance in thinking about how migrants speak, or perhaps if they speak on their own right, with their own words, when it comes to mediations of representation of migration and forced migration in particular. So debates on voice within this context are now well established. And they have started over a few years ago with a particular focus on mass media representations, and specifically on how mass media have for a long while framed migrants through the silence of migrants themselves. So there's a significant critique in media and communications literature, for example, of how migrants are spoken about and how they have been absent of setting the narrative of migration and that story and politics of migration. So this concern with voice has been established, focused for a long while on mass media. And of course, this is a conversation that has recently expanded in the space of digital representation. And in the space of digital representation, where voice has been reclaimed, perhaps celebrated as an opportunity to bring migrants in as actors who speak, not only actors who are silent and who are spoken about. Is this indeed the case? In this talk, I speak aloud of my own concerns and my own practice when it comes to reflecting and perhaps acting as an engaged academic with migrant voice. And this is an opportunity for me to ask in a clumsy, perhaps, in the clumsy way of asking a how question, but hopefully also to ask questions about the substance of whether and how migrants are actors who speak in their own right, with their own voices, in those expanding digital spaces of representation of migration, as very often we see promised and perhaps also reflected in various examples of social media projects and web platforms where migrants themselves speak. So in fact, we could say, and to play devil's advocate and to speak to some of the narratives that are becoming prominent within the space of digital representation of migration, we could say that indeed the spaces of migrant voice are now diverse, multiple, and we could even say that they're saturated. There's so many migrants speaking now. So what we have seen is that mass media, on the one hand, has been forced in many ways through lobbying, through pressures, to become more aware of dehumanizing reporting. At the same time, we have seen new cultures of representation, such as those, for example, of the original The Humans of New York, having set global norms of representation as recognition of different voices and different humans. Thus, we see that space of migrant representation, what I refer to also here as the space of subaltern voice, becoming much more diverse and complex. So is the question then of the migrant subaltern speaking or being silenced now fully resolved? The subaltern for sure now speaks, especially when it comes to all these different digital spaces. So in the context of digitization, I think it is time, as I know many of the people who are participating in this event and who are attending this talk know, in the context of digitization, it is important and it is time to go beyond the mere question of voice. The question of voice versus silence, to put it simply. So at times, at these digital times of hypermediation and hypervisibility of migrant voice, this question unhelpfully, I argue, simplifies the complexity of politics of representation, even though we still ask that question. So rather than thinking whether or not Western mediated spaces represent the voice of others for a balanced space of representation, I here propose that we think through Hannah Arendt's subjective in between, as she says, which is that co-produced space where we tell stories to each other in creative, even if an imbalanced, flawed, and difficult way about the claims, social claims, cultural and political, that we all make digitally, but of course, and always under unequal terms. Thus, with this talk, I'm hoping to invite you to participate in this reflexive space that myself, as I mentioned, I'm trying to engage, of these mediated representations of migration as politics of representational presence and recognition. This is a call beyond the binary voice versus silence, and rather, I hope, a call to consider digital storytelling as an intersubjective political praxis of representation, self-representation, and also justice. So in the next few minutes, I want to present a three-step argument through a three-part conversation. Part one focuses on the current regime of migrant voice, as I'm trying to show how liberal media and liberal institutions are trying to integrate voice in their attempts to fairly and humanly represent migrants. What we might consider and what we think the liberal mediated spaces of representation are seen as positive and humanized as representations of migration. I'm not going to talk at all to the deliberate and systematic negative representations of migrants, as I think that there is a lot of work, a substantial and important work done within this field already. And because this is not really what I find helpful for this conversation around voice. As I mentioned, I think the question voice versus silence limits the complexity of the debate of fair, a respectful and democratic participation of migrants in the media spaces of migration. So what interests me here instead, and what I will speak about, is that presence of voice. And specifically in this first part of my presentation, of my talk, specifically the containment of voice, which representationally tries to counter negative media narratives. In part two, after I speak to the current state of affairs, or what I understand is a current space of affairs, I propose an alternative to the dominant frame of conceptualizing voice within liberal, as this appears within liberal media and institutional frames of migrant representation. I'm sorry, I have, okay. Can I make sure that you're still on?
Yeah, we can still see you. That's a common problem I have on my desktop too. You might need to close some other applications if it keeps popping up.
Yes, oh dear, or just move it somewhere where you
No, just move it out of the screen. That also works.
Out of sight, out of mind. So in the second part, I propose this alternative frame of thinking about voice as this appears and dominates in these positive representations, the liberal positive representations of migration. And I propose instead what I call the critical humanist perspective to migrant representation, which I will explain as an ethico-political epistemology and method, which I try to adapt in thinking beyond the binary relations of migrant or voice versus silence. The third part and last main part of my presentation focuses on an experimental application of this critical humanist perspective as this applies to a project I led called the Digital City of Refuge, a web digital archive of the City of Refuge, which I will explain what means later on. And I conclude with an invite for all of us to think a bit more systematically of voice, not to think more systematically of voice through the ethics and politics of storytelling rather than voice as a media event of speech acts. So this discussion, of course, as we all know, who are participating in this event, is not new. The question of voice and, of course, generated largely in response to Spivak's question, does the subaltern speak, have been taking place for a while. And there are debates that are partly at least rooted in post-colonial critique and also cultural studies. And it is a critique that is centered in the long-standing systems of power that have perpetually silenced the colonized, racialized, and minority subjects so that domination over their lives and the extraction of their labor continues. We could extend this long-standing critique to think about the case of digital media in relation to that perhaps the extraction of subaltern creative labor and the legitimation of their subordination through their presentation as voiceless or agentless subjects rather than as participants in the making of their stories. So the subaltern silence has been critiqued within these post-colonial approaches. And then in relation to this critique, we have seen approaches that have put forward voice as a democratizing tool of how the subaltern can participate in democracy more systematically. And within those responses to subaltern violence, subaltern silence, my understanding is that much of the critique is a critique of what we could refer to as flawed applications of liberal democracy, especially as this relates to neoliberalism. So the assumption, I think, here in those approaches around subaltern voice is that as long as the subaltern gets opportunities to participate and to have an equal voice within the public sphere or the diversified public sphere, then this process of silencing can be surpassed. We can have more democratic politics. We can have more inclusive politics of representation over the subaltern. But what happens if the subaltern speaks differently, when the subaltern speaks in different spheres? What if we understand those questions of voice in relation to the subaltern setting the terms of engagement rather than being subjected to predetermined terms of engagement? I think these questions have not been adequately addressed within this critique. And these proposals of subaltern voice, though of course I myself get inspiration by those critiques that you see on your screen. So this is where I come in with the question of the how. And again, I'm aware that the question of the how, when Spivak herself, when she talks about the subaltern speaking, she doesn't only speak about the act, but the how is already implied there. But I think that it is the question that I want to set forward is that we have to think of that how not just as being implied, not just as relating to those fears of publicity that we take for granted, but also those fears of publicity that might need to be reshuffled. So how the subaltern speaks matters because voice, even though it is one of those core human capabilities to tell stories, the outcome of voice is not predetermined. And of course it is always subjected to norms and values. And of course, in digital media environment, it's subjected to digital norms and values, as well as political norms and values. So with digital communication and the diversification of platforms and opportunities and way of speaking changing, I think it becomes yet more important to think about the quality of voice and the regulation of voice as more central questions, those how questions, than perhaps in more simple media environments of the past, this question would be more easy to understand. So let me start now with that first part of the discussion that focuses on that empirical space of representation of subaltern voice. So what is the state of voice at the current space of publicity? We have already seen, I think, over the years, already a substantial shift. And of course, I'm aware I'm speaking from the European context, and this is the one I know most. But we have seen already a substantial shift in the representational space of migration. So I think that overwhelming or fully negative representation of migration that fully silenced or fully pathologized migrants straightforwardly define them as terrorists and criminals is now more exceptional than mainstream. However, at the same time, and here's a paradox, that even though we don't have those overwhelmingly hostile representations of migration, hostility and fear of migrants in social imaginaries in Western societies, and I think this is not just in Europe, is not necessarily in the retreat. So we do have a paradox, and we have media narrative changing, but not necessarily public social imaginaries. And I'm hoping that partly these conversations that this conversation that I'm engaging with here will help understand this paradox. So in Europe, at least, after the 2015 so-called European migration crisis, and I think for much longer in Canada and the US, academics, media professionals, and policymakers have addressed those concerns with negative representations through the lens of positive representation. So my understanding is that within these debates, positive representation is widely understood in three ways. And I think the first way to understand it is through language. So language in the media that does not dehumanize migrants. The second element is visually, use of visuals that do not dehumanize migrants. And the third dimension is that of voice, giving migrants voice, letting the subalterns speak for themselves. So where have these efforts taken us though? In preparing this talk, I thought I will have another check of how things look at the moment. And I will go to have a quick review of those sections of the media that seem, and they have a record of commitment to humanizing representations of migrants. And I started from The Guardian, precisely also because The Guardian has been at the front line of different debates and efforts for fair representations of migrants, and has committed to tackle the dehumanization of migrants in the media. So when a few days ago, I tried to look at what kind of stories recently have represented migrants in The Guardian, this is what Guardian itself presented to me. So perhaps you, like me, can see immediately what visually emerges in these stories. So that story that remains incomplete. So even in the context, even in the most positive context of representation of migrants, we see massification of migrants represented still. We see the infantilization of migrants, and the only close-up, as we can see here, is on the Home Office, that space of authority. Then I went to Le Monde, again in that random choice, to see what is going on in the case of another newspaper in another national context where representation of migrants has overall been more cautious and humanizing. You can see here that the visuality of those stories remains very similar to The Guardian. So in both cases, we can see textually reporting that avoids to dehumanize and reduce migrants to bare life. And as a rule, it avoids representing them as perpetrators. Visually though, what we see is an ambivalent representation. And we still see those visual of massification, of uprooting and infantilization still being dominant in these perhaps so-called positive representations of migration. And in the case of voice, what we have is, yes, we have an increase of subaltern voices speaking in these stories. But of course, as we can see in the ambivalence of that imagery that is dominant in this mainstream media, the subaltern can speak, but how does she speak? If the visual if visibility of the migrant is still very narrowly conceived and produced. So one might even despair of what we often see as little progress in mainstream media. And it's not just us in this context of a workshop like today that we see these representations, and perhaps we might despair and recognize that there is still a lot to be done. So to that limited effect of media adherence to the values of fair representation of migration beyond massification and infantilization, it seems that there are other institutional players that decide that they have a stake in communicating positively migration by giving migrants a voice. And in this context, we see an important element of the digital diversification of migration representation, which goes beyond that space of the mass media, but also beyond that space of social media. So we see the emergence of authoritative web platforms that are aiming to contest mainstream media representations. And I think this is also an element of a claim to representation of migration in parallel to social media, which are very often discredited, and also in the context of fake news and deep fakes are not seen like perhaps just a few years ago as spaces where democratization of representation takes place. So if mainstream media still have a way to go to let the subaltern become the central speaker in the narrative of migration, how do these institutional actors who claim to positively and justly represent migrants do? I want to refer to in the next few minutes to two projects that are quite high profile, and in which they speak to diverse global publics by bringing migrant voice at the core of their narration of migration. So the first project is the flagship I Am a Migrant, which is initiated by the International Organization of Migration. And IOM with this project clearly appears to commit itself to changing perceptions of migration. And as you can see in the About page on your screen, this is how the project presents itself. I Am a Migrant allows the voices of individuals to shine through and provides an honest insight into the triumphs and tribulations of migrants of all backgrounds and at all phases of their migratory journeys. While we aim to promote positive perceptions of migrants, we do not shy away from presenting life as it is experienced. We seek to combat xenophobia and discrimination at a time when so many are exposed to negative narratives about migration, whether on our social media feeds or on the airwaves. So we see that third pole, which appears as an authoritative and friendly to migrant space of representation emerging and making a claim to fair representations. What is important here, and what is important in the two examples that I'm sharing here, which is first is this I Am a Migrant project by IOM, and the second is the Aware Migrants initiated by the Italian government, but expanded beyond that. What is happening is that in cases like that, is that this attempt to tackle negative narratives about migration takes place systematically and assertively through the voices of migrants themselves. So the migrants speak, but how do they speak? And I want to quickly run through some of the profiles that I Am a Migrant presents of the people it celebrates, of the people it aims to humanize. Some of you, I mentioned already the example of the Humans of New York, because I understand that as being a key point in digital representations of identity. And we see some of those aesthetics that were initiated in that early project being reproduced in those positive representations of migration. So we have thousands of profiles on this digital platform. One of those profiles is that of Carlos, who is Indian. And you can see here how this person is being represented. So Carlos is Indian, but now lives in Italy. In Italy, I always felt more than welcome. People were intrigued by my differences. I was the Indian and mythical figure. And here we can see, of course, that combination of the good migrant and the grateful migrant with that of the mythical other, someone who is almost the divine unknown. And my understanding of the visuality here is that, as you can see, those lights on over Carlos' head almost look like a halo. So this idea of the mystical other are very prominent, I think, in this case. Then, of course, when we come closer to that context of forced migration, we can see Malakeh, who is a Syrian migrant who is settled in Germany, who is now an entrepreneur. And she is someone who's very much celebrated and used in this campaigning for migrant voices. And we can see her here presented and represented in two particular ways. So the quotation here on the screen is that in Germany, the old cathedrals remind me of our churches in Syria. There are no words to explain how much I miss my country. And in the smaller print, you might also be able to see how she explains how she became an entrepreneur and how that promise of success in Germany is what defines her present. The other element, of course, of this representation is that we see a Muslim woman on the screen, but somehow the quotation that marks her out as worthy speaker is when she talks about churches. And those profiles, Carlos and Malakeh, have been available for a while, but we see now a whole abundance and most of profiles on the I Am a Migrant project, which very much focus on people who still live in Africa. So the migrant who has not quite become a migrant. So one of those profiles that is promoted on this digital platform is that of Mama Jagi, who is from Chad and now lives in Cameroon. And she reflects on migration in her curated story when she says, the desire to go to Europe is in the quest for well-being, regardless of the sacrifices that must be made. But the West is not El Dorado, she says. And then she continues to say, you can live better in Africa. One can undertake in one's country with limited means at one's disposal what is so difficult to do in Europe. So in this profile, we see a woman, a determined woman, an entrepreneurial woman, celebrated. But importantly, this is a migrant who stays away from Western shores. So the African woman who speaks here has a voice, but she has a voice that comforts the West. She's recognized not as a threatening subject, but as a welcoming subject, precisely because she stays away from the West and because she doesn't make any claims to the discourse and the land of the potential listeners of her voice. And the last case that I want to refer in relation to I Am a Migrant is that the one that you can see on your screen of Suleiman. This appears the latest story, but it has been on the I Am a Migrant platform for at least 6 months. And this reflects a very specific politics of migration. The kind of voice that is very much welcome to speak in these spaces of presumably positive representations of migration. So Suleiman speaks and he says, my fellow brothers need to know that this route is one of sacrifice. You don't know how you will die, but chances are it will happen. So the thanatopolitics of migration, of those who dare to migrate without permission, tends to be becoming much more of that prominent narrative of how migrants are allowed to speak. And we almost see here that death is a punishment for claiming what one is not entitled to, the access to the Western lands and resources. Let me quickly move to give you some examples here of the other project which makes a claim to speak to migration and to concerns of migrants through the voices of migrants themselves. The project of Aware Migrants. So this is another digital project of Migrant Voices, and it was developed by the Italian government, as I mentioned, with the support of IOM, and it takes thanatopolitics to yet another level, but it does so through migrant voice. The voices on Aware Migrants, which I have been following since 2016, have gone darker and darker and much more centered to voices that speak of death, of self-punishment, of the foolishness of trying to migrate. So those who dare, as we can see, are naive at the very best. And we can see people appearing to using discourses such as those of slavery, but spoken by African men themselves. So we see how in these narrations of the self of migrants, we see narratives that play, for example, with this dark history of forced African migration and references to slavery, which are of course completely detached from the past and present responsibilities of the West, of Europe, of North America for African migrants becoming slaves. Many people speak on Aware Migrants as they do on I Am Migrant project. We can see that people speak with voices that lack that knowledge of the West. They're lacking rationality. They're talking about fate a lot. And I am sorry for the next slide if some of you find it upsetting. It is upsetting indeed, but this is the way one of the few women is represented in the website. So we see how migrants who make claims with their own voices are being punished. And we see the humiliating voice of punishment. This is not a screenshot I have taken. This is what Jessica, this woman, appears to say on the website. Humiliating, but of course, humiliating, contained, but through her own voice. So what is going on here? I think it is very important to see both in what I have discussed in other papers, but also, as I briefly mentioned here, how the narratives of voice, both in the mainstream media and what I discuss in a bit more detail in institutional spaces of mediated representation on digital platforms, play with voice, with those liberal ideals of voice, and the hope that the subaltern speak in very particular ways. So we see that voice becomes a media event that is appears not as a shift in the culture of representation, but as that moment where the other is granted voice. We see that the voice becomes a performative way for the other to take a very specific role, a very specific position within Western imaginaries, where they're talking about their lack of rationality, and they're talking in ways that most of the audiences who take a certain ordinary normative Western humanity for granted cannot identify as their own. So these are exceptional opportunities for performing very much that position of the other. And of course, these voices are contained and they are representing a conditional recognition. So none of these people who speak can be imagined or fully allowed to speak as equal within diverse public spheres, but rather they are aesthetically, narratively speaking within very specific and designated narratives of victimhood or entrepreneurship. So if voice is not enough, and if digital platforms who celebrate voice and put voice forward are not enough, then how can voice indeed relate to recognition beyond a very ordered space of appearance? How can migrants speak as reflexive agents, but also as partners in the production of knowledge and representation of migration? The problem with voice in the liberal politics of representation, I think, is that they do not challenge the racial and spatial hierarchical order of us and them, but only see it, and hopefully it's obvious in the examples that I shared, that others speak through very narrow roles of non-threatening otherness. The narratives of voice as a way to democratize the spaces of representation, of course, also do not critique the political and economic hierarchies that condition legal recognition of migrants upon a narrow set of conditions. And of course, they do not address questions of digital injustice. So what we need to do is to think beyond voice, I think, and we need to challenge these norms, which in many ways legitimize a deeply unequal order of appearance, rights, and recognitions, precisely because they speak through the migrants a very specific order of the West. So this is where I come to my part two and my own reflection of how we do that. How do we challenge contained voice? And I want to move from that conception of voice to the concept and the value of storytelling. And I'm talking about a critical humanist epistemology here, precisely because I think we have to reconceive and reclaim the concept of voice, not voice as media event, not as an occasion for engagement with predetermined and predefined publics, but as a way of being seen, heard, recognized, and respected as human with cognitive capabilities and desires to speak of freedom in inequality. If we think of voice as a dimension of storytelling, and that deep human desire and capability, then we can understand voice as an element of a devolved humanity. A devolved humanity where different actors can and should have the right to speak, and the right to speak as a praxis, as a political act, and as a committed practice that goes beyond that moment of the event. Devolving humanity and acknowledging and recognizing the right of all people to speak as storytellers and not just as individuals who are granted momentarily the right of voice, allows us to understand the multiplicity of the human history, and perhaps to open up social imaginaries to understand the diversity and the horizontality of the different ways to speak. A critical humanist epistemology, of course, needs to be normative and to challenge what Nuha Benjamin calls the architecture of power. So to digitally address how the narratives and actors of voice can be diversified and devolved, so that claims to humanity and claims to voice are not properties and determinations of the West. And this, of course, has an aesthetic dimension, which I think will be an element of the discussions you will be having over the next 2 days, where a critical humanist epistemology has an aesthetic dimension of delivering, of seeing and producing storytelling of voices that do speak, but do speak with voices that recognize just not only individual depoliticized agency, but also the unequal opportunities, freedoms, and vulnerabilities that we need to address in the context of forced migration. This critical humanist perspective has a methodological dimension, which very swiftly I will be talking to through an example in a minute. And the methodology that reflects the politics of critical humanism, I understand it as being translated methodologically into co-creative and participatory methods, ethics of co-ownership of data, and the co-creation of archives of voices that are diverse, open, and incomplete, and aesthetics that challenge that precise linearity and testimonial and singular way of speaking as the migrant, which is predominant both in institutional spaces of positive representation, but also within media spaces of positive media representation. And in this last part of my talk, I want to show some examples of how I, with my colleagues, especially my colleagues, Dina Dejeuner and Suzanne Hall, Christina Kolbe, the members of the Resilient Communities, Resilient Cities project, try to apply in the case of a digital storytelling project, which we call Digital City of Refuge, and which you can see on digitalcityofrefuge.com, just to promote the project. So this is an experimental storytelling digital open archive that we created in the context of a research project on the Digital City of Refuge, a project that we tried to address, a project that we designed in the context of the post-migration crisis in Europe, to understand how the actors of migration engage with each other and narrate stories of migration with each other in the places where they live. So we decided that instead of focusing on the migrant, we will focus on the cities where people end up as migrants, but also where migrants are received. So instead of looking at the migrant as the category and as the exceptional subject, we decided to focus on 3 European cities, Athens, Berlin, and London, where people narrate stories of migration together or against each other, either as those who arrive or those who are receiving. So I want to mention some of the dimensions of how we developed this project. Again, this is a many ways a flawed project, in many ways a project that could be much more better in many different ways. But this is an attempt to address and to put in practice that critical humanist epistemology and methodology. And I will try to show how we tried to do that in practice. So in relation to politics, I understand the epistemology of critical humanist politics of storytelling through participatory methods of narrating, witnessing, and claiming being and becoming human in the context of migration. So what does that mean? We decided to develop that digital archive of migration, not by predetermining identities and narratives of who the people are and how they speak, the migrant, for example, but to say stories of humans that are being and becoming in the context of migration, in the context of city of refuge, in our case. So we designed the project not, as you can see, this is the front page, which is a bit more interactive if you go to it. But we decided that it's very important not to tell the story of migration, but to tell the story through the different dimensions of what makes migration. So we're talking about cities, themes, and people. This allows us to move away from these individualized and exceptional opportunities of the other to speak, we hope, but we talk about the different dimensions of what consists that story of migration. This is an open archive that does not reflect isolated individual stories, but stories which are linked to human places, and with issues on concerns beyond an individualized and isolated exceptional experience of the other. You can see, for example, that we have themes. One of the main pathways into this digital archive is through themes, themes that emerged inductively based on what participants said. And these themes is where people speak with complex voices, not as grateful migrants or vulnerable refugees, but people who have different stories and who make different claims to rights, contest the denial of rights, and who have determination to speak to audiences they choose to. As you can see here, one of our participants who is determined, even though her Twitter account is constantly hacked, that she will not give up to talk to the world. The ethical dimension of this project and its critical humanist approach is an attempt, as I mentioned before, to shift the architecture of power. How do we do that? Against the norms of positive representations that deny political agency to migrants, the actors of the city of refuge do not just have voice to tell predetermined stories of uprooting and suffering, but they are political agents. Political agents that tell stories that are tackling the heart of inequalities, of mobility injustice and other injustices. And you can see here the case of Ainur, for example, a political refugee who lives in Athens now and who's from a Kurdish origin, who does not only talk about her uprooting as a refugee, but her commitment to fight capitalist injustice. Voices like that rarely appear, of course, within the mainstream media. We see, we try to include people who talk with different voices and identities and who sometimes try to find their places between identities assigned to them and others that count for them the most. So you can see here a young man, Sadhu, who says that I still think of myself as a refugee, but I also consider myself a Berliner, and ultimately I am a student. So people are not fully defined as refugees, and part of the stories that we managed to record with our non-binary methodologies was that, for example, of Sadhu, who in a different exercise, not in, that we use in a different creative method, where we used centripetal visualization of what is important in his life, recognized as important in his life Somalia, Berlin, WhatsApp, but also Adidas, because this is just a teenager like other teenagers whose sports life or sportswear is very important to his life. And of course, the story of migration is not just the story of the other, one that arrives, but it is a story of the life that people make together in cities, either by choice or need, that subjective in between, as Arendt puts it. And thus we include in this nonlinear storytelling archive the stories of people who are involved in the reception of migrants in the 3 European cities. And we try also to recognize, by respecting all these different voices and all these different actors, we try to recognize that power relations still remain uneven. And there are internal hierarchies in the ways that people are located within that story of the city of refuge. But this is also, that remains that space of interconnectedness that different actors try or have to speak to each other. And those receiving, of course, are not just white Westerners, but they're migrants themselves and also activists who lead solidarity and politics of respect for newcomers. So every city is and has been for a long time city of migration and refuge. And there are also actors who are trying in their very small way to challenge the many failings of powerful actors, such as the case of the London tech industry, in the words of Max, a privileged migrant himself involved in a coding school. And in the aesthetics of this project and in the critical humanism of the aesthetics of this project that we apply, we're also trying to devolve voice beyond that testimonial and singular self that speaks in a very narrow way in mass media and in institutional platforms about that story of migrant that is only determined by uprooting or a welcoming society. So we included profiles such as those of Leila, who insisted on putting on her best clothes to take the photographs, because we also offered each of the participants the opportunity to have their own profiles for their photographic profiles to use for sharing with their friends and family. And Leila put on her best clothes and she looks beautiful here. And while she looks beautiful and she reminds us that the migrant is a beautiful person with desire, she also talks, of course, about her struggles with austerity in London. So these people, we try to represent people who do have those complex histories, not only in relation to the migration journey, but also that experience of multiple injustices. Similarly, the case of Ali, who is a transgender Syrian person, we try to include the different stories that he told us about different journeys that he has been through, gender transition, as well as that experience of a political prisoner in Syria, as well as a story of the refugee. And his love for nature, for example, was something that we wanted to represent aesthetically in this website. Or the aesthetics of that everyday life of joy in the story of children going to school and learning to play music, while, of course, at the same time, trying to make sense of the different struggles that this new transition in a place, again, torn by austerity and hostility towards migrants, forces them and subjects them to. So, coming to an end of this presentation, I want to remind you again that in this, through the examples that I shared with you on our Digital City of Refuge project, I am not trying to claim that we did everything right. I think we did things more wrong than we did right. But it is, I think, that real commitment to try to link that critique and praxis of our understanding of voice and storytelling. Voice as an opportunity to speak, but also as not, to think about voice not as an endpoint in itself. So it was an attempt for us to think of that subjective in between with this project. Not what I or you say or experience separately, but what we say and do together when we're engaging to what each of us says and experiences, even though we do so in an unequal way and within systems of deep hierarchies and divisions. We understand that the digital representation in our case, like in every other case, is a performative space. But we feel that it's important to recognize it as an impure and incomplete archive that needs to be contested, as well as trying to represent the experiences and voices of people through respect to the way that they choose to speak. And of course, this means that this digital archive, like any other form of digital representations, needs to be contested within a space of recognition of migrant diversity. So, to conclude, I want to just highlight some of the key arguments that I want to bring forward with this presentation. Paraphrasing Said in his book, Orientalism, I want to start this closing by saying that storytelling is a way to challenge the inhumane condition. And there is an important value and praxis in thinking about storytelling as a quality of humanity that highlights, I think, the ethico-political imperative of thinking about representation and the digital representation of migration. So devolved voices raise questions about devolved humanity, humanity that is not a property or determination of the West. So the question of voice brings a big question. There is what is at stake here is a political dilemma, whether migrant voice is a media event and a narration or inferior humanity of the other, or a storytelling praxis of the agentive self within always, of course, conditions of unequally distributed freedoms. The question of voice needs to be part of a bigger narrative of how we understand the right to speak, not just an aesthetization of voice, the presence of voice, the presence of the migrant. So digital plurality is not enough, but the important question is how the subaltern speaks. And that matters for the way that people are recognized or reduced again and contained within an otherness, that cannot make claims to the same rights, to the same resources as the citizens, as the Western subject. So this perspective, I think, and I hope that contributes to the debates, the wider debates and the praxis on the decolonization of knowledge. The question of the subaltern right to speak as autonomous, creative and political agent is an invite to think about how we challenge that colonizing gaze and the hegemonic order that is very ordinarily reproduced within and through positive representations of migration, which do not challenge and rather in many ways re-legitimize who and how speaks in places that matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was truly a fantastic presentation that I think will spark a lot of rich conversation here and beyond in the workshop events later today. We're already starting to get some questions and we have a few minutes for that. I think we can go up to about 20 minutes for questions. And I wanted to start as others begin to populate the Q&A form that we have available to us. And so I wanted to ask, you're talking so much about voice and we're talking about language in terms of its descriptive nature. But as a Germanist, I was wondering about language in a more, I don't want to say practical because that's framing it incorrectly, but in terms of native languages, in terms of language barriers and the implications that has on thinking through these various understandings of voice. I wanted you to speak a little bit to language in that context before we turn to questions from our audience.
You mean language in the literal
yeah.
terms?
Like the various languages the migrants are bringing to the fore and how that impacts their ability to speak in the various contexts, because I think that all of these pages that you're sharing with us also featured translations and and so the language itself is being translated to be presented to us. And so I was wondering how that figures in some of the work that you've done, or how potentially it's been a barrier or changes some of this nuance in thinking about voice.
Yes, thank you, Biz. I think this is an absolutely important question, and as a media scholar, I haven't touched upon it, and thank you for bringing it in. I think one of the reasons that I emphasize that we have to think of those spaces of representations as always unequal, it's always involving different relations of power, is an invite to us to be reflexive about all these inequalities that exist there. So, as you mentioned, any of these projects, including our own, is defining the limits of voice through that domination of the English language, for example. And we have to be aware of what that means. In terms of the praxis, I think one way for us that we manage this inherent inequality in the order of the West and the Western language hierarchies was precisely to create an archive of the city of refuge rather than that story of migration. This is important, I think, because in practice, those of us who work with migration, we know that migrants, especially in cities, work alongside with through networks of solidarity that involve also the people who receive them and the people who are much more fluent in native languages. So if we think of that space as a space of communication, always with hierarchies, but one that is not always between a world of us and the others, then also we can understand, I think, the language as one of those structural and symbolic frameworks of inequality, but also of opportunity that we have to acknowledge and work with, but also challenge as much as we can. For example, in our another methodology that we have used in creative workshops for our projects, we have used a toolkit for researching and working with the city of refuge, which we have made open access, available open access for researchers and the civic society. And for this exercise, we translated all the material in all the languages that we used across cities. And this is again an attempt within our limited resources to democratize this space. But I think you're absolutely right that language, spoken language, written language itself reproduces in many ways many of those inequalities of voice and speech.
Yeah, and one of our participants chimed in as I was asking this question, commenting that accents and othering through quality of voice, apparent mastery or lack thereof in the colonial context, and sort of thinking through how this relates to the person coming to belong. So it sounds like you've thought through some of the logistical factors, and I think that's very, I laud you for translating all of these resources and making them available to other people. So another question we have comes from somebody in my own department, Marcus Hollensleben. Great examples and concept behind it. Thank you very much. I have two questions. First, about the term subaltern. Aren't we in danger of reiterating othering by using this category? And second, as much as I support the digital archive in your approach to documenting storytelling, I wonder whether colonialism could be a category that would have to be addressed as well. According to Genova, we cannot understand migration patterns today without looking at the history of colonialism. And we still have an ongoing colonialism at place, e.g. with the refugees and migrants settling in Canada. So there might be a double perspective at place with migrants decolonizing knowledge through storytelling, but at the same time continuing colonialism. And so would we as researchers?
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Two very important questions. To start with the second question around around colonialism, we're fully aware of the colonial history and the colonial systems of power within the regulation of migration, but also the regulation of knowledge around migration that take place. In our academic writings, we're referring much more systematically to those relations of power around colonization and the continuum, as I mentioned, colonization that shapes perceptions, shapes social imaginaries, reproduces many of these orders that we know about the good migrant, the grateful migrant, and the migrant victim, and so on. What in the digital city of refuge, we do not ourselves impose any concepts and interpretive concepts, because the purpose of the exercise is precisely to have migrants setting the narrative of their storytelling. So, for example, the themes that I mentioned emerged through what the participants said. And people did not systematically talk about colonialism. So we didn't want to impose an academic concept to talk about what they wanted to talk. However, I think the decolonization of knowledge is not taking place only necessarily by naming colonialism as a frame of analysis, but it's also about methodologies and epistemologies, which I'm hoping that I try to address through this critical humanist perspective I proposed. The other question about subaltern and othering, yes, I see your point. My understanding of the subaltern is more a political agentive category than the other. And I use it in this context. And again, I understand my interpretation, especially of Spivak's work, is that she uses it as a way to reclaim that space of identity and subjectivity, which might be silenced, but where political agency and complexity are not missing. But I think it's a good question that I will consider. Thank you.
Great. We have 2 more questions, and I think we will potentially wrap up this keynote event with. Ruben from the workshop today asks, does the medium, in this case digital media, contribute to the telling of a migrant story in a critical humanist way? And if so, how?
Yes, good question. I think that it does. I think that it does because digital media have an affordance of diversity, opening up spaces of different voices. But I am very cautious to say that digital media, sorry, let me just bring it back up. I can't find it now, but it's somewhere in there. So digital media have the affordance of diversity because the space of the digital media is limitless. So we can see even in these very mainstream projects of I Am a Migrant, the stories of migrants there are like, at the beginning there were dozens and then hundreds and then thousands, and you can navigate these stories and hear different experiences. Even of course in this case we know that they're contained within very narrow narratives. So the way we speak and are heard changes, the dynamics of voice I think change in digital media, but we have to be aware that digital media are also regulated. So even though the technology has the affordance for opening up spaces of self-representation and diversity, very often voices are regulated. They're regulated aesthetically, ethically, politically. So there are certain voices that are most likely to be read or heard digitally, for example, than others, because the aesthetical norms or the platform norms or even the algorithmic order decides who speaks and who doesn't speak. So definitely an impure and still a very unequal voice of space of voice.
Thank you. Yeah, I have some questions about the role of social media and migrants' own social media accounts that I don't think we have time for today, but you speak a little bit to that right there. As for our final question, coming from our audience, a question about participatory methods and recruitment for the project, as well as how these participants set the narrative. What kinds of questions or premises did you and your team approach them with, and how this interface with which the narratives emerged, etc. So a little bit about your methods.
Thank you, Gabriel. And this is a great opportunity to say something that I forgot to say when I introduced the project. We were very determined not to, and again, because this work, which engaged with migrants, followed previous work that we did on representation of migrants. So we were very aware of how migrants are very often asked to adopt this testimonial and linear way of speaking. So the interviewee, journalist or academic who has the best intentions, goes and asks people, tell us where you're from. Tell us about your journey. What are the horrible things that happened to you, and so on. So that encounter is predetermined within those specific boundaries of what it means to be a migrant or a forced migrant. And people, and you see when you're working with migrants, that migrants have been asked so many times to use the testimonial narrative, and they're asked by academics, they are asked by journalists, they asked by the asylum system, they asked from by everyone to develop this narrative. So we were very determined to work outside that linearity and the testimonial way of engaging with migrants. So what we came up with is the methodology behind the digital City of Refuge archive, which is what we refer to as urban storytelling walks. So what we did was to ask people in each of the 3 cities, and when we met them, to walk us through places that matter to them in the city. So we met Ali in Berlin, and we told him, take us to the places that matter to you. So we didn't ask him to talk to us about what it means to be a migrant. We didn't ask him to talk to us about trauma. We walked to the places that he decided that they were important to him. And this was the method that we applied across. So this methodology, again, I'm not saying that we did something amazing, but what we did was, again, to give the opportunity to each of the participants to decide how to set the narrative. And some people just talked to us about these great places they discovered in Berlin. And some other people told us, like the case of Ale, how it's amazing for him to spend hours by the river looking at the ducks, because this is the only space that allows him to think outside the trauma of what he experienced in prison in Syria, through torture, through his gender transition that has been painful, and so on. So people, it wasn't us who asked people to tell us these stories. They decided what stories to tell us, and we were completely open to the narrative. And the other thing that we did is that each of those stories and each of those images, where the final say and the final edit was from each one of the participants. So they edited the text in the final version. They chose which photos represent them. And in some cases, they changed parts of the narrative. And this was the right, and they own these stories. And we're very clear about that.
Wow. I think that's a great concluding remark. So thank you so much for this. I look forward to seeing you pop into our workshop tomorrow and continue this conversation. Thank you, everybody who has joined us today, and please feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in the larger project that we hope to build. You can find my contact information by probably just Googling UBC and Biz. Great. So thank you so much. We're going to conclude recording now and sign off.